All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Encouraging Truth series. We are glad you're joining us today. We started doing this series because we want to help jumpstart your week and hopefully give you something encouraging to know for the rest of the week that'll help you through your week. So that's kind of why we did this. First, if you don't know anything about our ministry, you can go online to womensbiblestudy.com. There you can find out everything you want to know about us. Lots of different ways to watch us. You can watch us anytime, anywhere. We have lots of guest speakers. We've done lots of series on books of the Bible, so lots of stuff on there for you. So for today, I want to give you our encouraging truth number 33, which is this: someday it will all make sense. But here's kind of a little bit of a disclaimer, and that's this: it may not be this side of heaven. A lot of times things happen and we don't really understand why, and we just need to know that as a follower of Jesus, we can learn to be okay with not knowing. Because what we do know as a follower of Christ is this, that we know there's a bigger picture. But for a lot of us, it's so difficult to look at the big picture. We've been talking about this a lot of the last encouraging truth messages, that it's just so much easier to look at what's in front of us, what's happening today, the pain, the hurt, the sadness, the rejection. But for a lot of us, that's what we tend to focus on. That's what we tend to live for. We tend to always be thinking about the bad. But can I say this? I think that when you and I become a follower of Christ, our thinking on those things should actually start to change. Because the more we get to know God more and more and more, the more we understand Him, learn about Him, the more we trust Him with this big picture that we may not see at the moment. Because in the big picture, it's this: God is always doing something. But a lot of times that something never makes sense to us, especially when there was like the car accident. Maybe a loved one died from coronavirus. Maybe the baby was born stillborn. Maybe the funeral was because of your drug-addicted child. Maybe it was your husband leaving you. Maybe a child rebelled against you. Maybe you were fired or abused, or someone just left you. And the problem with us as just human beings is that we want to know why. And we not only want to know why, we want to know why now. We have to know now. But as we grow in our faith, I want you to know that we can learn to be okay with not knowing. Because we can continue to trust God and still never really even know why what happened just happened. Just like a woman by the name of Helen Roseveare. She was a young medical student in Great Britain. She sensed a call from God to go to Africa. She became a medical missionary. She established a hospital, but she was doing all of her work during very big civil unrest at the time. What happened is the rebels took over their compound, and she was taken captive, held captive for nearly a year, which she was brutally, repeatedly raped by the soldiers. After nearly a year, she was released and she went back to England. But here's my question: why would God let that happen, especially to someone who was serving Him? We see another scenario in the late 1700s. William Carey left for India. He took his wife with him. She suffered from dementia, and many years later she died in India. A few years later he remarried. She too died. And William spent 20 years learning the language and translating the Bible into this specific Hindu dialect. But after 20 years of storing handwritten notes, converting, the Word of God into the language of these people, there was a fire, and it burned up all of his work. And back then they didn't have copy machines or like the cloud where things can be stored. And I asked the same question: why would God let that happen, especially to someone who was serving Him? And I think I have my own list of why would God, and I'm sure you have your own list of why would God. People ask me that. They'll be like, Lisa, why would God? And I stop them and I say, any question that is asked in that way, like why would God, I have no idea. I don't know why God does the things He does a lot of times. But Jesus said something to Peter that I think we can learn a lot from today. And hopefully that this encourages us when we don't know the why answers. Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends, but he's about ready to have his world rocked. He spent 3 years with him. He followed Jesus. He was one of the 3 that were in the inner circle. He believed Jesus was the Messiah. But in his mind, in his Jewish thinking mind, he also believed that Jesus would take over, wipe away Rome, become the king of Israel that particular way. But here's the deal, nothing happened like Peter thought it would. Because instead of Jesus becoming the king and overthrowing Rome, what happens is he ends up arrested, flogged, and dies on a cross. But right before Jesus gets arrested, we see this. John 13:1 says this, "Before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world, return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. It was time for supper, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he had come from God and would return to God. So he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around him. When Jesus came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, 'Lord, are you going to wash my feet?' And Jesus replied, 'You don't understand now what I am doing, but someday you will.'" See, that is a great verse that I think we can all hang on to. You don't understand now what I am doing, but someday you will. We see this all through the Bible. God just does things differently than we would, things that don't even make sense to us. We read about a flood that floods the world, and everyone dies and he starts over. Like, that doesn't make sense to us. Like wandering 40 years in the wilderness, I don't know, maybe you could wander 14 days, that would be okay, but 40 years? People like Joseph going to prison for doing the right thing? Like, I think we could all add our list of things that we would do completely different than God did. But we have to learn what Proverbs 3:5 says, that we have to learn to trust in the Lord with all our heart. Do not rely on our own understanding. Because here's the deal, we never know the whole picture, but God really does. But know this, we're always going to have a choice. We can walk away from our faith because nothing makes sense, or we can do what Helen did after being held captive. Being held captive and brutally raped over and over. You know what she did? She went back to the Congo. She established a hospital. She trained doctors and nurses. And there are literally hundreds of people who gave their life to Jesus because of her efforts. Here's what we need to learn. Even though it didn't make sense this side of heaven, she trusted God with what she didn't understand and kept moving forward. William Carey, the man who buried 2 of his wives and lost all of his written material because of a fire, he became known in history as the father of modern missions. What translations he did leave, he left. He built schools, and literally hundreds of churches in India. And a whole world of missionaries followed his footsteps. Here you go, even though it didn't make sense this side of heaven. He trusted God with what he didn't understand and kept moving forward. See, that's the difference between someone who really knows Jesus and someone who doesn't. Because we know that whatever goes wrong in life, what injustice, what tragedy that we may not understand for the moment, we fully believe that God is always doing something. So let's go back to Jesus and Peter. Think of what Jesus just told Peter. Hey, I'm going to wash your feet. Peter's like, what? You can't do that. That's what servants do. But Jesus is trying to show Peter, it's not just me washing your feet. There's this bigger picture in play. Because if you guys can't grasp the lesson of humility in me washing your feet, you are never going to grasp what is about ready to happen. Because when I go to the cross, it's going to be absolute humiliation. In other words, you don't understand now what I'm doing, but someday you will. So Peter protests in John 13:8. He's like, no. And it made me think, that's exactly what we do with God. We're like, no, God, you really don't know what you're doing. You shouldn't have let that accident happen. You shouldn't have let that person die. You shouldn't have let my husband walk out the door. And we constantly are protesting. Peter goes on to say, you will never, ever wash my feet. And Jesus replied, unless I wash you, you won't belong to me. Because Jesus is thinking big picture. This whole picture of salvation, whole picture of humbly going to the cross. And Peter is only thinking of washing feet. It's like Jesus is trying to get through to them. You don't understand this now, Peter, but something really devastating is just about ready to happen. I'm going to be arrested and beaten and hung on a cross, and you are going to need to understand that following me is about humility and about serving others. It's not about me becoming the king of Israel, the president of Israel, where you, Peter, will be my vice president and John will be my secretary of state, and there's a bunch of perks that are going to come with that. Jesus is going on to say, you know what, that's not what following me is about. In fact, it will be the absolute opposite of perks. It's all about serving. And you guys are going to witness this in the next couple days, but here's what you need to know. You don't understand now what I'm doing, but someday you will. So Simon gets all excited. He's like, all right, then wash my hands and head as well, Lord, not just my feet, verse 9 says. And I think it's funny when Peter says this because he has no idea what's about ready to happen. Because the big picture is this. The big picture is that Jesus is about ready to die on a cross and open a way for salvation, for people to spend eternity with him forever. That is a huge, huge deal. But remember, at the moment, it made absolutely no sense. And a lot of you, you're going through something that also makes no sense. But the key is, just like Peter, that we understand that following Jesus, we said this in a previous lesson, is all about surrender. Where you lead, I'm going to go. It's like Peter was saying, okay, wash all of me. In other words, no matter what happens, I'm all in. But Peter didn't realize to the extent of what that would entail in his life. And he was going to eventually, when Jesus died on the cross, have to ask himself, was I really all in? I don't know that I even understood what that meant. Jesus replied in verse 10, a person who is bathed all over does not need to wash except for the feet, to be entirely clean, and you disciples are clean, but not all of you. For Jesus knew who would betray him. That is what he meant when he said not all of you are clean. See, Jesus sees this big picture. Someone they all knew, Judas, a friend, someone they hung out with for 3 years following Jesus, would betray him, would turn him in, would get him arrested, would lead to his crucifixion. And remember the shock that these men felt. Because here it is, they could not understand at the moment what this was all about. What do you mean Judas is going to betray us? What do you mean he's going to turn you in? Like, everything was just a disaster. They could not even fathom what was going on. But I want to take that into our life, because we're always going to be faced with things that are not going to make much sense. And yet we're reminded of this scene with Peter, that what he could not comprehend at the moment, that he had to trust that God had a plan. And see, some of you, I'm hoping that you will be encouraged by that and take comfort in that, because maybe your child went to prison. Maybe your loved one suddenly died. Maybe the life you dreamed of came crashing down, or your best friend destroyed your life. And without knowing that God has a plan, you're going to fall apart, because it's not going to make any sense. How could they do that to me? How could that happen to me? How could God let that happen to me? But knowing Jesus means knowing there is something we do not see at the moment. For some of you, maybe 2 years from now, it'll all make sense. And you'll be like, oh my gosh, I get it now. But for others of you, this side of heaven, you may never, ever understand it. It may never make sense to you. And it's going to be a mystery. But then someday you're going to get to heaven and you're going to be like, oh my gosh, now it makes sense. Kind of like a man by the name of David Ring. Technically speaking, David Ring was born dead, although because of the quick-acting medical personnel, they were able to keep him breathing, but oxygen deprivation left him with cerebral palsy. He suffered from a speech impediment, his hands that didn't cooperate, he limped. And if that wasn't adversity enough, both of his parents died by the time he was 14. His hemophiliac brothers died of AIDS. And David's remaining family were just fearful that he would never have a normal life, that he would never be able to marry or have children or drive a car or earn a living to take care of himself. But as a young teenager, David came to surrender his life to God. He didn't understand it. It made no sense to him why he was born this way, but he understood this. He came to see his disability as a gift. Instead of spending his life angry with God, and why is my life so difficult? Instead of trying to make sense of why this was happening, he began to see his circumstances as being chosen for him by God. Isn't that a great attitude? Like, everything I'm going through is chosen by God because he has a purpose and he knows he has a reason for what is going on in my life. And when he did that and surrendered his life like that, he could move forward. And today, you know what? He's married. He has 4 beautiful children. He drives a car. He speaks to more than 250 audiences a year. And at his speaking engagements, he always sells t-shirts that say this: "Don't whine, shine." I think that's great. But David took responsibility for his life. He took responsibility for the bad things, the difficult things, and the wonderful things. He said when people wrestle with the difficulties in life, the why question always gets in the way. One of David Ring's axioms is this: don't ask God why, ask what. What do you want me to do with this? Because all through life, just like the disciples, things are going to happen in our life that's going to shock us, take us by surprise, confuse us, make us question God. But if we can hang in there and really understand this, that encouraging truth says someday it will all make sense. Maybe not this side of heaven, but when you understand that there's always a purpose, that it will make sense at some point, I think it might make our journey just a little bit easier on this earth. Because by saying that someday it will all make sense, we kind of acknowledge that we may not understand it now, but we're trusting what Jesus said to Peter, that you don't understand now what I'm doing, but someday you will. I hope that really encourages you today. Have a really good week.